It's the Belle of Belle da Costa Greene, medieval flow. Olive complexion, green eye reflection, proud black lady, but maybe not in detection. Not 'cause neglection.
Hey listeners, thank you for joining me for this bonus episode of Boss Like Belle. Last time I shared some exciting news that I'm going on secondment from Houghton Library to Widener Library at Harvard to lead the public engagement project. It's all about rethinking how one of the world's premier academic libraries connects with the public and opening up a space in Widener Library to welcome them in. It's about breaking barriers, sharing knowledge, and creating a space where scholars, students, and the public can come together to learn, explore, and be inspired. So I've started the job, and on my very first day in the role, as director of the public engagement project, I spent some time with my dear colleague, Peter Accardo, who is the curator of the Harry Elkins Widener Collection, to learn more about the history of this incredible space. Let's go behind the scenes with Peter. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Anne-Marie.
Thanks for meeting me on the front step of Widener. Should we go in?
Absolutely. It was by design that when you walk into the Widener Library, you see Harry's portrait directly in front of you.
I used to feel like it's just a bit of a workout coming into the book.
It is.
It makes you work for it.
Well, now we're entering the rotunda that we use for display purposes. Currently on view, there's a nice overview of Harry Widener's life and the history of the library that bears his name. Now we are into the space dedicated to Harry's library.
That's great. Shall we take a seat? So, Peter, welcome to Boss Like Belle. Could you say a little bit about what you do here and how long you've been at the library?
Sure. I'm Peter Accardo. I'm the curator of the Harry Elkins Widener Collection. I've been at Houghton now and this library for nearly 40 years.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Whenever I introduce you to people, I always talk about you as a kind of like walking, talking encyclopedia of Harvard history. And that's why I'm just so grateful to chat with you today about the history of this library where I'll be working for the next 18 months.
Yeah, and I want to congratulate you on that new role because in many ways, you're bringing something back to this library that we once had. And I think it's something that's been sorely missed by the public. So I wish you well in that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you start off by telling us who Harry Elkins Widener was?
Sure. Harry Widener was the scion of a very wealthy Philadelphia family. He went to private schools in and around Philadelphia before coming to Harvard in 1903 as a member of the class of 1907. And even at that time, he distinguished himself as a collector of books. After his time here at Harvard, he worked kind of as an investment employee with his father's family firm, and then, sadly, had the misfortune of being on the Titanic in 1912, where he lost his life along with that of his father and 1,500 others.
What was he doing on the Titanic?
On that particular trip, his sister was getting married. And so Mrs. Widener had planned to go to Paris to buy things for her daughter. Harry had in mind to visit some bookshops. I think the father might have been looking at artwork.
And is it true that Harry was on his way back? He had some books with him that kind of like went down on the ship too?
That's exactly right. The most famous one, of course, is the Bacon. He had a 1598 edition of the Essays of Bacon. A.S.W. Rosenbach, who was one of his great book collecting mentors, relates that he had told his mother that he was going to save that book and keep it on his person, and that if he went down, the book would go down with him.
Wow, my goodness, that's incredible. So what happens next? Like, we are sitting in a library named after Harry. How did that come to be? And can you tell us about the history of the library before we start to talk about this incredible room that we're sitting in at its heart?
Sure. For many years, decades, in fact, Harvard was in desperate need of a more adequate library building. For years, books were piling up, inadequate facilities for faculty and readers. And no donor stepped forward to provide Harvard with a better library. For many years, the library was Gore Hall. This was built in the 1830s, 40s when it opened.
Yeah.
And so for many years, it served its purpose. It underwent two major renovations. In 1907, there was an addition that provided the first treasure room at Harvard. But finally, by the time of Harry Widener and his collecting, when the bad news that he had not survived, his mother, who was very eager to preserve his memory, provided Harvard with the funds to create not only this beautiful room that we're in today, but for the larger research library around it.
Wow, that's amazing. Can you describe the building for my listeners? Some people may be familiar with Widener, or they may have seen it without even really knowing what it is, because anytime Harvard is in the news, Widener tends to be the building that's shown in the background, etc. So if for someone who arrives from the front of the building, what do they first see?
What they see is an enormous building made mostly of brick, which is consistent with the rest of the architecture in Harvard Yard, and enormous steps that lead into the main hallway, where you find marble columns leading up to the Harry Elkins Widener room that we're in now. In front of this room, there's a beautiful rotunda that features Alabama marble. Within the Widener building itself, there were two very deep courtyards that go down the full extent of the building, something like 10 stories overall. In more recent times, they elevated the floor of those light wells to create two reading rooms that now flank the Widener room that we're in now.
That's incredible. And so when Widener first opened, was it it was the kind of like main, like central library of the university system?
That's right. It was a central research library. And at the end of the 19th century, Harvard began to receive very substantial gifts of books and manuscript material as well. The professional libraries and other discrete libraries within the library system, the university archives, the fledgling theater collection needed a suitable home. And so this library was designed not only to meet the needs of researchers, but also to provide space for these different discrete libraries that had been formerly scattered throughout the campus.
That's amazing. And, as you know, in my new role, what I'll be responsible for is opening a part of the building to the public and welcoming them in so they get a sense of the history of the university and how the libraries, like what role the libraries play in what we do here on campus. What do you know about the past engagement of the public with this building? Because I think I was under the impression that it had never been open to the public, and it was actually you who told me that that's not true. Could you say a little bit about that history?
Well, sure. I can't give you a comprehensive history, but what I can tell you, and I think this relates to Belle da Costa Greene's achievement at the Morgan, from the day this library opened, exhibitions were a very important part of what this library saw as its mission. And the exhibitions that were held here were advertised in the local press. There were times of day when the general public could come and access them. There were lectures that were often given in conjunction with the exhibitions. And so it always had that function, I think, of edifying not just affiliates of Harvard, but for anyone curious in the history of the book.
That's fascinating.
And if I could add, you could enter through the front steps of the building. There had been turnstiles installed to prevent the public from getting into the areas where the delivery room was, what we call the circulation room today. And there were no IDs required then. But I think the profile tightened after 9/11. And I think that's when you found a much stricter approach, I think, to library security.
Oh, that's fascinating. And then, so I guess that in its long history then, because this building opened in 1914, right?
1915.
15, okay. So it's just like the last 20 years or so,
That's right.
21 years that it's been a bit more restrictive. So we're kind of in some ways going back to its original roots in terms of like being partially open to the public and welcoming people in. I'd love to talk a bit more about the room that we're sitting in right now and more about Harry and his mother and their relationship with Belle and just that whole world in the 19 teens. So could you describe the room that we're sitting in? Yeah,
it's a very elegant space. And this was very consistent with what Harry's mother wanted, as part of this memorial, to be a room that would inspire.
And where is it in the building? Like for someone who's coming up those big steps, this big monumental building, neoclassical in design, and then you come inside the front entrance, then what? Where do you find this?
When you enter the Widener Library, by design, if you look up, you can see, a few hundred feet away, a portrait of Harry Widener that's over the fireplace. That was by design.
Yeah.
And so he's inviting you in basically to his own library.
Yeah.
And this is true to the man. Harry was very eager, always available to share his collection with others, mostly notable people in the book collecting world at the time he lived, but anyone who would listen. He had a younger cousin, or a cousin named Peter, who leaves a recollection of Harry's bedroom, where that's almost a misnomer. He had a very small bed surrounded by a very large library and a work table covered in books and catalogs. And we'd often read aloud to this cousin of his. And so I think this room is really meant to be inviting and inspiring. So when you come up these different flights of steps, you'll notice two beautiful murals by John Singer Sargent that were done at the time of the Great War. Passing those, you come into this beautiful marble lobby right in front of the Widener room itself. Two very large oak doors are there to be opened.
They're huge. Like, how many feet are those? They look like 12 feet or something.
Yes, maybe more. And the woodwork that you see in this room, and this is not probably as well known as it should be, but the woodwork in this room was done by a firm named White Alum, a British firm that's known for their commissions from the royal family.
Okay.
They also did design work at the Huntington Library, the Frick Collection in New York, and also did work for the Widener family at their beautiful home outside of Philadelphia, Linwood Hall.
Fantastic. And I mean, the ceiling is so high in here, and the light that's coming in is really, it feels kind of palatial, but kind of like studious at the same time. So definitely in that vein of a kind of like gentleman's library with the wood paneling and the portraiture and the desks and everything. So is this meant to recreate any room, or
not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there are at least known photographs of what Harry's library looked like when it was at Linwood Hall. And so I think that I wish there were more archival research that could be done that might yield a family photograph album where we could see exactly what the library looked like when it was still in Harry's possession in Philadelphia. But one point I haven't mentioned yet is that the building itself was undertaken by a design firm of Horace Trumbauer, and he had working with him a very gifted designer named Julian Abel, an African-American. Abel's achievement is not as well known as it might be because, unfortunately, a lot of sign drawings don't exist. He is credited with a lot of the design work of the library generally. I think that the paneling might have had his hand, but I suspect that might have been more the British firm that was used to design the look of this particular room. But a lot of the other design attributes of the building, I think, go back to Abel and his genius.
Well, to me, when I first became aware of him, I was quite frankly amazed that there was an African-American architect in the 19-teens, like working in Philadelphia. Trumbauer was based in Philadelphia, right? And then like responsible for this project. And it's certainly a part of the history of the library that we're now making an effort to make better known. Is he a figure that you were always aware of, or?
I can't remember when I first came upon his name, but it was a long time ago.
I'm looking across the room and I'm looking at the desk over there. Was that actually Harry's own desk? And can you say a little bit about the flowers on it?
Sure. One of the features of the room is this beautiful desk that was owned by Harry Widener. I've been told that it was his desk. So it may have been the very one that was in his bedroom that Peter Widener remembers seeing. There's a blotter on that desk that only recently I noticed had silver corners. And on those corners, you'll see Harry's monogram or initials HEW engraved upon them, and a beautiful lamp. But at one corner of the table, you'll also see a small bouquet of flowers. That was Harry Widener's mother Eleanor, who wanted to be sure that there were always fresh flowers in this space. And so dutifully every Monday, these flowers are brought in.
They're stunning. The other thing that jumps out to me here in the room is, of course, the Gutenberg Bible. Can you say a bit about what Harry collected, what these books are, and also about the Gutenberg Bible?
Sure. Let me start with Harry's books.
Yeah.
From a young age, Harry was an avid reader, and his mother encouraged him in that. And in fact, it really was his mother, before Harry had means of his own, to lavish wonderful gifts on her son, editions of Dickens and Stevenson, the authors that Harry preferred to read, and that he went on to have a very distinguished career as a collector and gathering in his personal library. While he was at Harvard, he took part in theatricals at the Hasty Pudding. That got him curious about costume design, and that brought him to the area of collecting of color plate books. And so you'll find Harry having a really good eye for books from the 18th, 19th century that featured color plates. If you think of the satirical or the caricature work of George Cruikshank and Thomas Rowlandson, his collections are very deep in both of those two artists, book artists. But mostly when I think of Harry Widener, his greatest strengths were collecting Victorian writers, mostly novelists, people like Stevenson, Kipling, Dickens. And then he branched out. Once he graduated from Harvard, he saw other opportunities, and he was encouraged in taking those opportunities by people like A.S.W. Rosenbach, the great Philadelphia book dealer. He started collecting American books, preferably those with inscriptions. And so you find some very beautiful copies of the great works of 19th century American writing in the Widener collection, oftentimes in original condition and with really important inscriptions added to them.
That's fascinating. And I mean, this collection is pretty large, right? But he didn't acquire all of these books himself during his lifetime. Can you say more about the size of the collection and also the books that came posthumously?
Sure. There are about 3,000 books in the Widener collection as we see it today. After Harry's death, his mother was determined to fill out want lists that he had left just with his book dealers, particularly Rosenbach. And so no expense was spared to fill in those gaps. I couldn't give you a percentage as to how many books were actually purchased posthumously, and even the ones that were purchased in Harry's lifetime, that it really was his mother that was making possible for him. I mean, most notably are the 4 folio editions of Shakespeare. Those were purchased by his mother because Rosenbach said any collector needs to have them in their collection. And so Harry's mother made that possible for her son.
So she, I think, was a formidable figure. Can you tell us more about Eleanor, both before and after the tragedy that befell her family?
Sure. Eleanor came from a distinguished family in Philadelphia. And what's interesting is that her grandfather, P.A.B. Widener, Harry's grandfather, I should say, had a business partner named Elkins, and it was Elkins' daughter, Eleanor, who married Harry's father. You know, so the business partners created a marriage. And she was, in fact, a strong woman and a collector in her own right. Silver and porcelain, jewelry. She received really wonderful gifts of jewelry from her husband and probably of her own choosing. And so she came from a family of collectors. I don't think I've mentioned yet that P.A.B. Widener, the patriarch of the family, made his fortune first providing provisions to Union troops in and around Philadelphia. Then he moved into the kind of...
During the Civil War?
Yes, during the Civil War. And then, you know, after that period, made fortunes in different industries, blue chip industries, tobacco, oil, and then also in the mass transit business. So they were pioneers in creating mass transit systems within big cities, not just in Philadelphia, but elsewhere in this country. And so Eleanor lived the part. She was an advocate of tennis, although we don't know if she actually played tennis, but often had these very beautiful events around tennis. The family had a presence in Newport, not surprisingly, and they had a beautiful home there that was also designed by Trumbauer.
Oh, I see. So the same architects. That's fascinating. And so she was widowed, obviously. Like, not only did her son die on the Titanic, but also her husband. But am I right in understanding that she remarried a few years later, and the man she married, Rice, was his last name?
Yes.
That she met him at the opening of this library. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I actually have proof of that here in front of me. And can I talk a little bit?
What's this that you have on the table in front of us?
Well, not long ago, I was acquainting myself with the collection, and I noticed behind Harry's desk an object that hadn't been cataloged yet, that turns out to be a guest book that has been maintained here in this room from the day the library opened in June of 1915, right on through the 1940s. And so what you'll see here, and you can take a look yourself, Anne-Marie, but in bold at the top, you find the name of Eleanor Elkins Widener.
Yep.
And below that name, you'll see the names of Harvard's President Lowell, Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who was also a great book collector and who was the featured speaker that day. Many notable members of the Harvard faculty, members of the Widener family, the Elkins family, and later down on the list, you'll see the name. Where is it now here? I want to get this for you. A. Hamilton Rice.
That's the second husband, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so she had, I think, first met him during the cornerstone laying ceremony. And then he was present at the dedication of this library. And within 5 or 6 months, they were married.
Good for her.
And one other connection that not so many people know is that Rice was an explorer.
Yeah.
He brought Eleanor on some of his expeditions to South America, but he was also an important figure in the kind of a geographical society that has its own building here at Harvard, not far from here, but it's another Trumbauer commission. So there are two here at Harvard.
Oh, that's so interesting. Let's talk about now Belle da Costa Greene and Harry and the Wideners, generally speaking. So also in the book in front of us here, you were the one to point out to me that Greene had also signed the guest book. Can you tell us a bit about when she signed it and what she wrote?
Sure, and if I could just back it up a little bit.
Yeah, please do.
Before Widener was built, Belle da Costa Greene had a presence here in Cambridge, and in a guest book, or not actually a guest book, it's more of a diary that William Coolidge Lane, who was an important Harvard librarian at the time, I found an entry there that indicated that Belle da Costa Greene had visited the previous treasure room that was in the short-lived space in Gore Hall before it was raised to make room for the Widener Library. So as early as 1909, Belle was consulting Harvard collections. Fast forward to the dedication of Widener Library, and within a few years of its dedication, you find Belle in 1921, I think, or is it 22? 1922, she's visiting the library, and she's dated that visit 9 January 1922. And then later on, I think she makes a second visit in 1925. And guest books like these, I think, are maybe an underutilized genre. We see a lot of interesting work done now with guest books like this because it allows you to situate in a place and a time individuals who may be of interest to us today. And so having these two signatures of Belle da Costa Greene, place her in Cambridge, place her at Harvard, and it makes you wonder why she was here on those visits.
No, absolutely. And I think she visited like fairly frequently. She had a lot of connections on campus between curators at the art museum at the Fog and librarians here as well. And in fact, from my understanding, looking at her correspondence, she recommended the first two Widener curators to the Widener. So your predecessors.
That's right.
Then, so it was her who recommended Luther Livingston. He was the first curator of the collection, but I think he died within a few months of taking up his position, right? And he actually writes in a letter to her about his poor health and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's yet another tragedy that's
Yeah.
associated with this great library. Luther Livingston was a noted horticulturalist and a world traveler. So the kind of personality that I think Mrs. Widener would have appreciated.
Yeah.
He was appointed by Harvard to become the first librarian of the Widener Collection. And Harry had a very close relationship with him. And yet, I think it was on Christmas Eve, 1914, he died tragically, relatively young man.
Yeah.
And so it was George Parker Winship who came to Harvard to take the role of curator. He didn't have that role as long as he might have because he took on other roles within the library. But it was Luther Livingston's wife, Flora, who in the 1920s was appointed the Widener Collection curator. And in that role, she did remarkable things.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. In a letter from Greene to Bernard Berenson from January 1915, she wrote, so just a few weeks after Livingston had died, I got my friend Winship, the librarian at Providence, the librarianship of Mrs. Widener's Memorial at Harvard, at $5,000 per year, which is good for him as he only got $2,500 at Providence. And we are hoping that in time he will be made the university librarian when that doddering old dame is out of the way, as Winship is the second best man in the country. And Mrs. W has made quite a good little bargain for herself and will give the library quite a boost. Who do you think the doddering old dame is? You can't be talking about Mrs. Widener, can she? I don't know who else that would be.
Well, that's the only name that came to my mind, but it seems so.
Wow. And then the other reference I found to the library from Greene is from February 1915. So if the building didn't officially open till June, she must have seen it just from the outside. And she wrote, I went over to inspect the Widener Library. It is incredibly huge, but I did by no means hate it as much as the Harvard people seem to do. It is built of red brick with white trimmings and is labeled in letters a foot high on both sides, Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library. The exterior is, I think, very dignified, and the building would look wonderful if there was more space around it. So what is she referring to when she says, I did by no means hate it as much as the Harvard people seem to do? Was Widener not popular?
Well, I think
the architecture of the building.
Well, I don't know that I've ever read that anywhere, but I think there had been a concern about the size of it. Where Harvard had a very kind of stately and quiet presence for hundreds of years, and now occupying the center of the campus was this enormous library building. Gore Hall, which was raised to make space for Widener, had a much smaller footprint. And so you probably would have had something more of a kind of a pastoral feel to the yard at that time. And it might be people who were just longing to have more grass and trees.
Yeah.
But I don't know that architecturally, I've ever read any account of someone not liking it as a building. In fact, just the opposite, I think.
Yeah, it does dominate this part of the yard. Peter, if you could meet Belle da Costa Greene, what would you ask her?
That's a very good question. Well, I think when I think of her as an inquisitor, and those of us who've worked at Harvard in the library in particular know how important that activity is and all the gifts that you have to be successful at that. When I consider, not that I'm an authority on it, when I consider the volume of material that she brought to Mr. Morgan and then after his death to that library, it's extraordinary. And probably laboring under a lot of disadvantages, because that world was predominantly run by men, wealthy men, probably difficult men in many cases. So for her to succeed so triumphantly in that role as an inquisitor, I think I would probably ask her about what talent she had in that.
Yeah.
How did she find these people? How did she create networks of acquisition that redounded so greatly to the benefit of the Morgan Library that we know today?
Yeah, I'm sure you could have a field day asking, just because you're a historian of the book world, of Harvard in particular, and all of these people who we've mentioned today, like the Winships and the Livingstons and the Wideners, they're people whose whose names you live and breathe, and you know them as these kind of figures, but she actually did know them. And I can imagine that you would have amazing conversations with her about all these people that she interacted with,
Sure.
that
Well,
you know of through the books.
Yeah, well, she herself was part of that first wave, I think, of scholar librarian.
Yeah.
There had always been people at an institution like Harvard that cared about books, but it was really at the end of the 19th century as America began to rise in prominence, not throughout the world,
Yeah.
that academics, librarians responded in kind. We needed to have world-class libraries to support the mission of the country. And so she was a part of that first wave, really, a professional librarian doing this work of collection building, all toward the goal of leaving students and the rest of us material to work with to create new knowledge from.
And what does bossing like Belle mean to you, Peter?
Well, I don't know that I have a good answer for that, but what I can share with your listeners is how I first met you. I remember meeting you in the Houghton Stack, surveying MS Lat.
Can you say what MS Lat is?
Sure. These are Harvard's or Houghton's collection of Latin manuscripts. And Bill Stoneman, our friend, was the one who introduced us at that time. Yeah, and you were just getting underway with your work on the Beyond Words exhibition. And so that was a first encounter. Fast forward to when you were appointed the Associate Librarian for Collections, that conference for Beyond Words had a Saturday session, and I was actually tapped to work that session. And I remember seeing you come in, and I introduced myself as your new colleague, and you were my new boss.
Yeah.
And so...
That's so funny. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I can't believe that's now 8 years ago.
Long time now.
It is. Well, any last parting words or anything you want to share?
Well, I think fittingly, the last thing I might say while we're here has to do with the Gutenberg Bible.
Yeah,
you mentioned that
please.
earlier.
Yeah.
I think you probably will gather from what we've said today that Mrs. Widener was very much devoted to the memory of her son in creating this great memorial. But that loyalty and that love didn't just reside with her. When P.A.B. Widener died, he left a copy of the Gutenberg Bible that Harry himself was aware of. He kind of coveted the book, I think, but knew that it really wasn't for him. The book passed from P.A.B. Widener to one of his sons, his surviving son. And when he passed away, it passed then to Harry's surviving brother and sister. And they thought it was appropriate in 1944 that book, one of the 48 or so surviving copies of the Gutenberg Bible, should reside here in a collection of books that was formed by their late brother.
That's fantastic. And can you say in a few words what the Gutenberg Bible is for people listening who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, Gutenberg Bible is acknowledged as the first substantial book printed with movable type in the West. It was made around 1454 or 55. No one knows exactly when. And printing with movable type actually is an invention that goes back to China around the year 700. But that technology didn't make its way west. And so from the perspective of Western civilization, it is the most important first book printed with movable type. Harvard's collection of such things now is around the third or fourth largest in this hemisphere. And the Gutenberg Bible that we have on display here in the Widener Collection is really the cornerstone of that collection.
Peter, I've heard that a story that someone tried to steal a copy of the Gutenberg Bible from this room in the 60s. Is that true?
It is true. There was a lot going on in the country in 1969 in August, that summer. In Widener, there was a gentleman who hid in the men's bathroom on the third floor, and after hours lowered himself on a rope into the Widener room itself, breaking a window to gain entry. He managed to make off with the 2 volumes that we have of the Gutenberg Bible, but didn't account for their weight. At least that's what the story tells us. And because of that added weight, he wasn't able to climb the rope back to the top of the roof and must have dangled there for a bit before falling 6 floors down to the bottom of the light wells. And it was on the following days that some custodians found him groaning at the bottom of the light court. And fortunately for him, he fell on the Bible, which may have saved his life. And he suffered minor injuries, but it was actually much later that a court psychologist deemed him to be of unsound mind, which may have led him to commit the deed in the first place. And only after about 2 months of being watched was he let go.
Wow, what a story. I can't believe that. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And I'll just end the interview on something a little frivolous, but I know people who visit Widener, especially the tourists, they ask this. I've heard, just walking through the yard, tour guides saying things like, when Mrs. Widener gifted this library to the university, she also stipulated that all first-year students had to learn how to swim or something like that. They had to be. That's not true, is it?
No,
where does that come from?
It's one of many apocryphal things, that I've heard over the years that the tour guides have told visitors.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard other people that probably should know better saying things about the library that aren't true.
Yeah.
And the other one like that, I think, has to do with ice cream.
Oh, no, what's that one? I haven't heard that one.
That you had to have ice cream always available to students in the dining hall.
Maybe it was a student who spread that myth around, try and get some yummy dessert. Thank you so much.
Medieval flow.
That's all for this bonus episode of Boss Like Belle. Join me next time for the final episode of the series. I'll be joined by Martha Whitehead, Vice President for the Harvard Library and University Librarian, to learn more about the public engagement project, the vision behind it, and why it matters now more than ever. And Rahel and I will be reflecting on the Boss Like Belle journey I've been on this past year. Don't miss it.
Well, I am so thrilled that you agreed to take on this role. It's really fabulous. And, I think in one of our early conversations, you talked about your purpose statement, and I know you've talked about it on this podcast as well, and that you want to make people feel at home in historically exclusive places and entitled to participate. So that's my biggest expectation, is that you keep that as your North Star. I think that will be really important. And then I want you to boss like Belle. And that, to me, that means being confident in your expertise and ideas, being bold.
The second woman and the first person of color, Miss Belle da Costa Greene, unlike any other.